Hello, everyone. Welcome to this AquaHacking 2019 info video on the thematic of building resilience in your shoreline communities, floodproofing your home and your community. This is a presentation prepared by the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. I am Scott McKay, and our Sarah Rang will be giving this presentation in just a few minutes, right after I give you a few words on the city's initiative and present the purpose of today's presentation. So first, well, we want to share background on flooding so you can think of your innovative solutions. And we'd like to inspire you to build your AquaHacking team. The city's initiative is a binational group of 100 US and Canadian mayors and other municipal leaders. Our purpose is to advance the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. So we work on mainly three topics: water quality and quantity, infrastructure, and climate adaptation. So we are the voice of mayors in many forums around the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin. We promote and are involved in different projects and work with several partners such as AquaHacking. And we're interested in flooding basically because we provide our member municipality with tools that they need to effectively adapt their infrastructure and their municipal operations to a changing climate. And we want to help cities evaluate their infrastructure needs and keep their community safe by preventing and preparing for more frequent extreme weather events. So let me introduce Sarah Rang.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Sarah Rang. I'll take you through the rest of the presentation. We're interested in flooding, and if you haven't experienced flooding in your particular area, it's hard to imagine how extreme it has gotten in the Great Lakes Basin. I'll show you a few pictures of what we mean. This is an example in Gatineau along the banks of the St. Lawrence River. And really the scope of the problem is illustrated on the right-hand side. 30 years ago, the insured losses for extreme weather events were averaging $400 million a year. And in the last decade, those losses have skyrocketed to almost $1 billion or more every year. So this is from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. So obviously flooding is a big economic cost. This again is from Gatineau. They saw record floods, had to do evacuation of their town and a number of different neighborhoods. They had to involve both the province and the army and declare a state of emergency. That's not limited to just that area of the St. Lawrence. We're seeing extreme flooding throughout the Great Lakes Basin. This is an example from Chatham, Kent in 2018. And again in 2019, just a month ago, they have declared another state of emergency from the extreme flooding from the river that flows through Chatham, Kent. This is our proposed issue statement for this water issue. Indicating that communities are often the first to feel the effects of climate change. And we're seeing increased floodings and extreme weather events across the basin. Flooding is the #1 cost in terms of property damage in Canada. So the area that would appreciate any assistance from the AquaHacking teams is really about how can we reduce the climate-related damages and the economic losses from flooding for both individuals, for communities, for infrastructure, and also for the environment in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Basin. There's a couple of different ways to look at this issue of flooding. You can look at it as we need new measures to prevent flooding from happening in the first place. We need measures to reduce flooding impacts when flooding does already happen. And we really need new measures to facilitate recovery from flooding. And we've offered up 4 different areas that an AquaHacking team could choose to focus on. You could choose to focus on flooding within your home, flooding within your community. Of particular interest to us as an organization is protecting infrastructure. These are our roads and bridges, and especially our drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in many towns. And also protecting the waterfront and the shorelines, and also the environment. So lots of choice in terms of how you might scope your team. What's causing the flooding problem? Lots of different reasons and factors here. One of the main ones being the climate change in the Great Lakes region. This just gives you an indicator of the changes that we're seeing across the basin based on the most current science. Average daily temperatures increasing, frost-free season, that's the number of days that the lakes are not frozen over, so is increasing by 16 days. In other words, they're not frozen over as often as they used to be. Total precipitation increasing by 14%, and this real heavy precipitation events increasing by 35%. So there's a little more detail here on some of those issues. The extreme weather, as we mentioned, both the frequency and the intensity of severe storms are increasing. Precipitation is increasing and falling in big bursts that municipalities are having trouble dealing with. The lake levels naturally fluctuate on the Great Lakes. Right now, we're in a period of very high lake levels. And so you can imagine when you have high lake levels plus rain, it's more likely that you're going to have a flood. The precipitation is increasing in the Great Lakes region, and we're seeing it in different ways. We often see problems with flooding during the springtime when we have this rain on snow event. You might have experienced it in the last couple of weeks in your region as well. The other issue around the problem with flooding is this idea that our infrastructure is just getting older, and the infrastructure funding gap. And by that, we mean that we're just not putting enough investments or money into infrastructure for the job that's required. So it's not just happening in the Great Lakes Basin. It is a sort of global phenomena. When they're looking at the global risks, one of the major risks is the failure to respond and adapt to climate change. And the global infrastructure gap is estimated to be $18 trillion. That's the difference between what we should be investing in our infrastructure and what we actually are. In Canada, infrastructure is generally split out 3 ways. The federal government pays 1/3, the provincial government pays 1/3, and a municipal government will pay 1/3. That's a general rule of thumb. There's many different infrastructure programs, and they all have slightly different rules. But what you do see is this infrastructure, our roads and bridges, under mounting pressure. In Ontario, a lot of our infrastructure is just getting older. It needs more upgrades and replacements, and we've got a rapidly growing population, again, fueling the need for new investments. So the gap in Ontario is estimated to be at least 60 billion in terms of the difference between what we should be putting into our infrastructure and not. So we'd just like to turn our minds now to a couple of the different impacts that we're seeing on homes. And this is divided in the 4 levels that we talked about. An AquaHacking team might want to look at one of these levels. You're welcome to look at all of them, but you might want to think about focusing on one of them. So what we're seeing in general is basement flooding on the rise. And if you've ever had your basement flood, you know how stressful and costly it can actually be. It's becoming increasingly common in Canada, especially along Ontario and Quebec. And again, some of the reasons we talked about. What we're seeing is the average price tag being about $43,000 to restore a flooded basement in Canada. And there's a tendency now that if you've had multiple floods in your basement, it's getting harder and harder to get insurance. The other new aspect about flooding, we've always known about the potential for mold to grow and it become a health impact, and the sewage to also kind of contaminate all your belongings. But the other part that we're learning about now is that there's substantial mental health impacts on homeowners. About a half of the people who had experienced basement floods say that they still worry every single time that there's a severe rain, even 3 years after their basement had flooded. You'll also see big economic impacts in terms of people taking time off work to deal with their poor basement and missing at least a week of work. So some interesting new human dimensions to flooding coming out. When we look at the impact on communities, we see that municipalities are often on the front lines. They're in the front lines in terms of prevention. Municipalities work with a number of different partners to figure out what areas of their city are prone to flooding. They do emergency planning. They are involved long-term in terms of the separation of combined sewers. And these are sewers that join together both the stormwater that runs off your backyard and your streets, and also the sewage that runs through your toilet and down. So in some cities, not all, they have combined sewers, which when it floods, have a lot of difficulty because the volume is just so great. During a flood, municipalities again supply the emergency personnel. They arrange the evacuation. Often you have to shut off the gas and electricity because that becomes a big hazard. You have to organize volunteers and communication and keeping all your essential services working at the same time as providing security so you don't get a lot of house looting and those kind of things. After a flood, when the river or the waters have receded, you'll see a lot of work going on with cleanup. And we're beginning again to see ginormous volumes of waste materials being generated after a flood. The drywall, all the stuff that's coming out of the basement. If you've ever gone through a flooded area after a flood, you will see whole front yards filled up with basically garbage coming out of the basement. Again, we're real need there to figure out some more innovative solutions to deal with the waste issue after flooding. There's a formula to apply for emergency assistance, and of course there's a large number of bills to pay. When we look at the third area, which is impacts on infrastructure, we're seeing our infrastructure under stress, as we mentioned before, but climate change will increase the cost of infrastructure. Sometimes you have to build a pipe bigger because you've got more rain going through it, or you have to make the bridge support stronger or bigger or wider because of the impacts of erosion and climate change. We also see big impacts on our wastewater treatment plants. These treat our sewage, easily overwhelmed by water flows, and you face the very difficult decision, do we only have enough ability to disinfect it and not to fully treat our sewage? Drinking water intake pipes also, if they're just downstream in a long river like the Grand River or many of the other rivers, you can be threatened by the sewage and the contaminants from upstream flooding. And the damage to dams, bridges, railways, pipelines, and roads are considerable. What we're also seeing in the Great Lakes Basin is huge impacts on the shoreline. We're seeing a lot of erosion going along the shore, both the wind and the wave damage, sometimes ice damage along the shore. And it's the shores of the lakes, but it's also happening up along the rivers. Huge costs. The mayors are facing huge costs to repair their breakwalls, their piers, their marinas. And we're also beginning to get, at least along some shores, the really hard thinking going on about what are we going to do when the shoreline is different in the future. And again, when we have this erosion, you disturb all your infrastructure. So your pipes, your pipelines, any utility lines that are running under there. It's not all doom and gloom. There's lots of opportunities, and that's really where AquaHacking comes in, is to try and find some innovative solutions to some of these areas. If we're looking at the level of the home, for example, there are some new programs coming out to help homeowners to identify the sources of basement flooding and also to reduce those risks. So we'll talk a little later about that, but that's really one of the best things that homeowners can do, is some practical small measures to help reduce your risk and your damage. So that's a huge area of where we're happy to have AquaHacking teams work. And also we talked about the damage and waste and disposal after the flooding as well. There's community level examples, as we need some more help in terms of flood mapping and developing resilience plans. Certainly, we probably aren't going to be able to have the same kind of design and financing of dams and dikes and water infrastructure. We're going to need to think differently. And there's this idea of green infrastructure, and by that we mean wetlands and natural areas that can help really play a role in terms of slowing the water down and reducing floods as well. Communication is a big issue during emergencies. There are emergency protocols on how and when to communicate, but often at the same time as you're flooding, sometimes your internet goes down or your phone system, and so communication can become a big issue. And again, we talked about the wastes after flooding. Can we do a better job there? In terms of the third area, infrastructure, there are some new tools. They're called infrastructure vulnerability assessments. These are formal assessments of infrastructure from the risk of a climate change. And so they go through methodically and talk about and identify which bridge in your community might be the one that is most at risk, and how can you fix that up. And there's this idea of critical infrastructure, that some infrastructure may be more important or critical in the event of a flood than others. Is your community only have one bridge between two halves of your community, in which case that bridge is going to be your critical infrastructure? Or is it your drinking water plant and keeping the lights on in your drinking water plant? So there's the idea of identifying critical infrastructure and planning how in different emergency scenarios, that critical infrastructure is going to continue to work. So we have some specific challenges listed here. We have a big problem with septic systems in rural areas where they're not connected to their wastewater treatment plant. They have individual septic systems on their property. When those flood, a lot of the contaminants are released into the water. Are there better ways to design and maintain and fix our septic systems so that they're a little more, they don't leak as much during flooding? Drinking water and wastewater plants, similarly, can we think of some new ways or new tools that can help us there? And the city's initiative has a climate-ready infrastructure and strategic sites protocol, CRISP we call it, which is one of these vulnerability assessments. It's an existing project. We've done it with 2 different municipalities, been very well received. Right now, it's just a paper-based system. We'd love some help to make it more of a web-based or digital-based system. This is an example from Chatham, Kent, which is in southwestern Ontario along Lake Erie. This is what they're predicting their shoreline will look like in the next 100 years. So the green line is where the shoreline is right now. The kind of yellowy green line is where they expect the shoreline to be within 50 years. And the red line is their predictions for 100 years. What you can kind of see there is there's a road right underneath that red line. And there's a whole bunch of cottages that will no longer be on land. So this is the example that municipalities are doing to try and figure out what to do about shoreline. Obviously, it may not be worth investing any money into fixing that road over the next 20 years if you know in the next 50 years it's actually not going to be there. So there's opportunities along the waterfront. Here's a few questions that Scott and I get all the time from mayors about what can we do about this huge problem of our waterfront and shorelines are going away, and our boats and marinas are not working the way we wanted. So we just put these out here as a way of indicating where the needs are from municipalities. You know, how do we improve forecasting? Can we do new materials? You can read through these questions, and if there's any that interest you, would be happy to discuss it further. In terms of expected outcomes, we're hoping to develop tools that are affordable, user-friendly, and deployable in any one of the areas that's of interest to you, either at the home level, the community level, the infrastructure level, or the waterfront level. I won't go through these slides, but there's a lot here about if you need help or if you want to learn more, there's individual resources here that are identified. These ones are ones that are at the home level, and I'll just talk about a couple of them. The main one here is from the Intact Center, which is at the University of Waterloo and funded by Intact Insurance. They've developed this home flood protection assessment, which is designed to help homeowners figure out what to do in their basement. There's lots of interesting material there. There's lots of opportunities there. Also, I just want to let you know that AquaHacking in 2018, some of the teams did focus on flooding. So before you go too far, just make sure that you've reviewed what they've done just to avoid any duplication with previous teams' works over the years. The other resources there, please take a look at them. There's many good resources in terms of home flooding materials. These are the resources for the community level. You'll see there's a lot of overlap between the slides. There's new materials out on the Conservation Ontario website, and there's a new Canadian Standards Association work as well. In terms of resources for infrastructure, here's some suggestions. These are just the start. I would suggest you take a look at some of the keywords, green and gray infrastructure vulnerability assessments. But again, if you have questions, please ask. And in terms of the resources for shoreline, here's some suggestions to get you started to learn a little bit more about the issue. I'm going to leave it there. We're happy to, hear from you. This is our contact, Scott and myself, and we're really hoping that we'll inspire you to build a team around flooding. It is a major issue that we're facing, and would appreciate any help that you may be able to lend. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Scott for final comments.
Thank you, Sarah. So, well, this concludes our presentation, and please feel free to contact us at these two email addresses. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great AquaHacking challenge. Good luck to you all.